Hey everyone, I'm back to do a commentary on the chapter Direction of Progress from this book, Awareness Through Movement by Moshe Feldenkrais, which I'm trying to hold inside the camera frame. And this is the last section of part one of the book, and it's probably the last video I'm going to do for now, because in part two of the book, he has the Awareness Through Movement exercises, and I just have to think through what would be the best way to present that. But again, I urge you to go and get a copy of this book for yourself. This is a really great introduction to awareness through movement. And what I've been doing, reading through the book up to this point and doing commentaries, is all the sort of preliminaries that he gives you before he invites you to explore the movement through the processes that he created. So my hope is that this is, in any case, a very good beginning to the basic principles and ideas behind the Feldenkrais method. And again, I hope it's going to help you see how practicing Feldenkrais could be part of a broader cultivation of wisdom in your life. Okay, so in this chapter, the direction of progress, Feldenkrais is going to come back again to the unique nature of human beings, and he's going to talk a lot about the human mind, and in particular the fact that humans are capable of abstract thought. And this is kind of what makes us so great, and it's also can be our downfall. So he's going to talk about that, and he's also going to talk about how that relates to another theme that's been woven through all of the chapters up to this point, the experience of the individual, and then the relationship to the world beyond the individual. So he begins by saying we live in two worlds. We have our individual world, we have the external world, and then awareness, which is, of course, at the center of what he is teaching. He talks about how in the course of evolution, with humans being at the sort of very end of the evolution up to this point, right, that awareness has been expanding. And he says, because we have awareness, this is what allows us to engage in abstraction and what allows us to observe ourselves and kind of ponder our own experience. This is a quote: "Awareness is consciousness together with a realization of what is happening within it, or what is going on within ourselves while we are conscious." And he's going to talk about now two different levels of awareness. A very basic level would be being aware of what the voluntary muscles are doing, your thoughts, and the capacity for abstraction. More advanced is to become aware of the involuntary musculature, the senses, the emotions, and the creative capacities that we have. So that's more difficult to do, to really be able to regulate on the level of the emotions and some of these deeper processes in the body, but he's telling us we can do this. So how do we gain this greater control? Well, one basic principle is that some parts of ourselves we can access, but they're always connected to a whole. So in earlier chapters that we've already discussed in previous videos, Feldenkrais talked about in every moment we are moving, sensing, feeling, thinking. Well, the movement is something that is easier to look at, like he was just saying about the voluntary musculature. If we can learn to control that better, it's always part of this whole system involving these four elements. So we can begin by learning to control essentially what about ourselves is the easiest to control. And by doing that, we're going to make a systematic change. We're going to raise our levels of awareness and sensitivity, and then we might be able to dig a little deeper to discover how we can regulate and be aware of other levels of our being that are our experience, you might say, that are further below the surface. So now Feldenkrais is going to talk about development. And the way that he's laying out his argument, you could look at it in terms of a long-term question of evolutionary development, but what he's after is to help the individual. So it's even just the development within the course of one's life. And he says, development stresses the harmonious coordination between structure, function, and achievement. And a basic condition for harmonious coordination is complete freedom from either self-compulsion or compulsion from others. So that last bit is incredibly important. Self-compulsion and compulsion from others. So in previous discussions, we talked about societal expectations, what happens to us if, for example, we don't have the kind of career success that we think we should have, or in romantic relationships, whatever it is, there's a compulsion that we have to think that we should be fulfilling certain things. And if we are unable to do that, that affects the self-image. On the other hand, we maybe often growing out of that compulsion that comes from society, that comes from the family and elsewhere, we have self-compulsion. Just think of it as your inner critic, right? So long as we're doing things because we should do them, because that voice or some person in our lives, or maybe even our employer, is telling us you must do this, well, we can't really develop under those circumstances. That's not the ideal conditions for moving forward in our lives. And another big obstacle is this question of abstraction, our capacity to observe ourselves and to think about our own experience. Just think of the inner critic, right? The inner critic is there and it can ponder and then it can talk to you. And meanwhile, you're trying to actually get something done, right? And it's not helping. He says, abstract thought and verbalization occupy the most important place in science and in all social achievement. But at the same time, abstraction and verbalization becomes a tyrant who deprives the individual of concrete reality. So it really is kind of a paradox. You just think of everything that modern culture has achieved, all the innovations, the different systems, the fact that you're watching this video on the internet right now, all of that is the result of abstract thinking. But abstract thinking, it's also one of the easiest ways to shoot ourselves in the foot. And he goes so far as to say that it leads to mental and physical illness, premature senility. Again, when we get carried away with that abstract voice, when we're not connected really to reality. He says when we get better and better at abstraction, then our thought becomes disconnected from our sensing, feeling, and doing. So this is a contradiction. Also, there's the fact that strong feelings, so before he's saying you don't want to disconnect from your feelings, but at the same time, strong feelings muddle our thinking. And so we need to actually often separate ourselves from our feelings to develop our thinking, but we can take that much too far. So what's the sort of Goldilocks place in between? Another quotation for you. Creative, spontaneous thought must maintain a link with the early brain structures. Abstract thought that is not nourished from time to time from deeper sources within us becomes a fabric of words alone, empty of all genuine human content. So again, the earlier structures, this includes the limbic system, this includes the basic impulses we have for survival, right? He's saying we need to stay connected to that. And interestingly, he underlines here that one of the ways that we disconnect is through words. So he then brings up the idea of thinking in images and how, and this is a theme he's often using, and when he's teaching the awareness through movement lessons, one of the constant features is, along with the movements, that you are imagining. Sometimes you're not moving, you're just imagining, but even when you are moving, you're imagining the relationships, you're sort of trying to visualize, and you get to the point of maybe moving your arm through space and feeling it and, imaging it, where you don't have to actually speak to yourself and say, here I go to move my arm through space. All those words are not actually necessary to carry out the action. So he talks about also in communication that we think in images, but then these images are subsequently clothed in words in order to establish human contact with our fellows. So that's another thing that humans have done, right, so well, at least maybe not in the present day, but the collaboration, right? You think from hunter-gatherer societies onto modern communities and governments and whatnot. This is done through communication. It's done through words. So this abstraction, and language being an abstraction away from this sort of like more just base experience, it's necessary. But he's talking about this process of first thinking in images, then clothing the images in words. So in any case, we see the positive, we see the negative, we see the contradiction, and he's just going to tell us that abstraction is why this phrase he's used before, harmonious development, is just much more complex in human beings. Okay, from here, Feldenkrais kind of ponders something. I don't know if we should take it as the gospel, but it's pretty interesting. He asks, where does this abstraction come from? And this awareness that was developed. And one key thing that he talks about is our ability to differentiate left from right. And how did that happen? When we know our left from our right, what we're essentially doing is we're dividing space in half, and we're dividing it with us as the center of the world, right? So this is, he says it's to turn to the left or to the right is one thing, but to actually sort of orient, this is my left hand, this is my right hand. When I make these videos, I think it actually looks different for you, but I promise you, this is my left hand. So he's sort of saying, how did this happen? And he writes, man must at one time have paid attention as he moved, alternately to what went on inside him and in the world outside. And he says it's this shifting of attention between the inside and the outside that led to abstraction, because words, this is again maybe his conjecture, but it's an interesting one. He says the words help us describe our relative position in relation to the world. So interesting to think about. And often you'll notice with different people that some people actually get mixed up with left and right. There are Feldenkrais lessons where you're twisting yourself around in a pretzel. You're doing things like, like the eagle pose in yoga, or the famous interlacing of the fingers habitually and non-habitually, things that actually make it a little puzzling to your brain sometimes, which part of you is your right and which part of you is your left. But this is a very basic and important thing. In the case of Nora, one of Feldenkrais's books, where he writes about working with a woman who had suffered a stroke, one of the things that they really worked on was actually understanding left and right again, because he at a certain point realized that Nora didn't understand this, and that this, before they were going to do other things, this absolutely had to come first. So anyway, these differences that you might see among people between in their capacity to be clear on left and right, and we all get mixed up sometimes, it makes a more general point that this idea of awareness is also somewhat variable in the population. It could be something that is based on I don't know, someone's background, but some people have really worked to cultivate their awareness and others have not. In any case, even in a single individual's life, you just think of yourself, there's moments where you've been more aware and moments where you're less aware. So awareness is this flowing thing, but it's highly desirable, especially given that we are these funny creatures who have the ability to think abstract thoughts, which can help us and harm us. So at the end of the chapter, he does a kind of a funny, kind of a cool thing. He brings up this Tibetan parable, and he sort of maps onto the parable his themes that he's been working with. So in the parable, you have a sleeping coachman who is directing the horses who are pulling the carriage. And he says the sleeping coachman is awareness. But obviously a sleeping coachman is not going to take his passengers where they need to go. So it needs to wake up. And when it wakes up, it can direct the horses. And he says the horses are like the muscles, right? So we've been talking about the use of the musculature and how the feeling and awareness comes through the musculature. And then who is sitting in the carriage? The skeleton, right? It's our physical body that we need to move through space. So essentially, in order to go where we want to go, in order to do what we want to do in life, we need awareness. And it's interesting, I just had a discussion recently with a colleague of mine, Matt Zepelin, who's written a history of somatics. And he talked about how a number of the somatic pioneers, including Moshe Feldenkrais, they had kind of a utopian view of evolution. Like if we just keep evolving and we'll just keep getting better and better, as opposed to the idea that, you could evolve and get better and better. And then, an asteroid could come from outer space and just wipe everyone out, right? So there's an element of chance to evolution too. But he is talking about a better future and that awareness is the key. And so just a last quotation from him. Man can make discoveries, invent, create, innovate, and know. He grasps that his small world and the great world around are but one, and that in this unity, he is no longer alone. And so that's a quotation that finishes up this story of the awake, aware coachman using the muscles to take the carriage of the skeleton through the world, successfully arriving at each desired destination. And what you can hear, he grasps that his small world and the great world around are but one, is an idea that almost begins to sound a little bit religious, right? It's this sense of connection between the self and the greater world beyond. And again, just referring to my discussion with Matt Zepelin, another point that he made about somatics, which I think is really interesting to think about in the world that we're in now, which is increasingly moving towards a secular world. Of course, there's still organized religion out there, but many people no longer trust the organized religions. For other people, they, like myself, I grew up without religion, right? But there's something about this broader connection that's really necessary, right? If we're all going to evolve successfully together, if we're actually going to continue healthfully into the future, our future generations. And what Matt Zepelin was talking about is that practices like the Feldenkrais method that might begin with the muscles, that might begin with the physical sensations, they can take us to this place of realizing a greater connection and even open us up to more kind of spiritual experiences. Now, whether or not spirituality in a word is what we're after here, again, my view is that a greater sense of how we connect into the world all around us is increasingly crucial in today's day and age. We can't just simply work on ourselves and ignore our relationships. We can't just think of our local community and forget about the rest of the world. So in any case, I'll just wrap up by saying what I've said before, but I do think that the Feldenkrais method, even though some of Moshe's ideas, maybe we need to update them for today, I think that the practice he's created is an incredible way, beginning with the body, but then sort of noticing how the principles of how he approaches movement can be generalized into approaching the way that we deal with our thinking, our emotions, our relationships, and our larger worldview. I really think the Feldenkrais method can be a key tool in the cultivation of wisdom, together with other practices that highlight, other questions. I'm involved these days in the relational practice of circling, to give one example. I've been participating in dialogos, which is another form of relational practice pioneered by John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist from the University of Toronto. And so I'm going to end this series on the Awareness Through Movement book right here, but I hope you will check out the other videos on this channel, including some of the conversations that I'm doing these days, the embodied dialogue. My hope, again, is that I can be part of joining in with others by sharing the Feldenkrais method and by sharing these ideas in creating dialogue and hopefully working together on the cultivation of wisdom here in the world of today. So thanks so much for watching. Take care.